Previously, we'd gotten our feet wet with a little theory. Before we go further, though, we need to back up, way back to even before we got out our keyboard. We need to understand something utterly fundamental about music. Tones and chords do not sound good or bad in and of themselves absolutely. They sound good or bad in context of other tones and chords. Well, of course, a single tone may sound good by itself. The C major chord sounds good by itself. But it is always possible to arrange tones and chords in ways that would leave a good sounding chord sounding bad. By the same token, you could arrange tones around a bad sounding chord in a way that makes it sound good. Here's an example. That's E and C played simultaneously. It sounds pretty good. But now follow that sweet sound with C and F sharp. That sequence probably doesn't sound nearly as good. That second chord is very jarring, both in itself and also as the follow-up to the first chord. It casts a retrospective shadow over that first chord because the first chord is now part of a harsh sequence. Your ear probably doesn't know which of the pair is to blame for the harshness, and if you are asked to fix it, there's a good chance you'd have no idea what to do. Now let's add a third chord to the mix, and also fill in the first two chords with a few extra notes. The notes we started with are still there, they haven't been altered, but they have some additional company. How does it sound now? The whole thing should sound much better. The sequence as a whole works well, and each chord of the sequence works well. What happened? It's not that we fixed the chords, or that we followed up that jarring second chord with just any old successor chord. We followed it with the right kind of follow-up chord, and we tweaked the first two chords so that we would be prepared for that follow-up chord. The moral? Notes and chords can actually become decent if they're surrounded by the right kind of company. By the same token, they can also be ruined if surrounded by the wrong kind of company. So it's not enough to build good sounding chords. Sequences of chords can also sound good or bad, and many a time when you think you've got a sour note or a sour chord, it may be the sequence that's causing the problem, not a particular note or chord. Now that probably sounds kind of scary. You probably don't want to memorize a rule like the compound of C and B flat sounds good if immediately followed by F and A. There would be dozens or hundreds or thousands of such rules you'd have to memorize, and that would be as aggravating as memorizing rules like 54 plus 23 equals 77. It's much better to have a single procedure that will give you the answer to all the possible questions. Unfortunately, there isn't a single procedure that will give you all and only the good chord sequences. But there are a handful of rules that will let you generate an enormous number of distinct, complex, and good-sounding chord sequences. To keep things simple, I'll describe them in the key of C major, though eventually we'll make the rules more general so that they apply to all the keys. First, a definition. The major chords in a key are called the primary chords. In C major, the primary chords are C major, F major, and G major. Wait, didn't we already meet these guys in the last lesson? Didn't we already call them our primary chords? That's right, I slipped a definition past you while you weren't looking. Now, if a piece of music were a sports team, the primary chords would be the big, strong, fast guys who've spent years practicing their skills. They're the ones you use most often. You start with them and you end with them. In fact, you can go the whole piece using only them. You pull them out and stick in a substitute only if they are getting tired, which means you are getting tired of hearing them. The primary chords are not quite created equal. In the key of C major, the C major chord will be the alphaest of the bunch, because it's his home key. He usually starts things, and he almost always ends them. But he plays well with the others. When progressing through a sequence of chords, you can follow the C major chord with either of the other primary chords, and you can follow either of the other primary chords with the C major chord. The G major chord is the number 2 guy. He's an okay dude, but if we're being tactlessly honest, we'd say there's something a little odd about the way he's always hanging out with the C major chord. In fact, it sounds strange when you don't follow G major with the C major chord. That being said, you can go from the G major chord to the F major chord. Just don't bounce back and forth between them, unless you want to drive your listeners crazy. Okay, our metaphors have been pretty stupid up to now, but at this point it's best to change to an even stupider metaphor. If the 3 primary chords were the 3 Stooges, then the F major chord would be Larry. This chord works well with the other 2, but whichever chord it's paired with, it's always the second banana. It's great to have the F major chord, but for long stretches you can get away with using only the C major and G major chords. But like the C major chord, the F major doesn't play favorites and can be followed by either of the other two. Now all of that was just metaphor. Here are the patterns we just described. But you don't need to memorize this pattern. Just memorize one definition and one rule. Definition: C major, F major, and G major are the primary chords in the key of C major. Rule: any primary chord can go to any other primary chord, but prefer to follow G major with C major. You could almost get away with just these two rules, because as I said, those three chords are the primary chords, and it is perfectly possible to get through a lengthy piece of music using only them. That's because we can add a second rule, an iterative rule, that lets you apply the first rule to any sequence that the rules have already produced. It says, sequences of chords can be joined together by common elements. For instance, our rule implies that the C major chord can be followed by the F major chord, and vice versa. This lets us generate two different three-chord progressions, C major, F major, C major, and F major, C major, F major. We don't have to stop there. Let's take the three-chord progression C major, F major, C major. C major can be followed by F major, and it can also be followed by G major. That implies two more possible progressions. And so on indefinitely. But such sequences run the risk of turning dull after a while, because it's the same three chords over and over again. So what if we wanted to change things up? That will be the subject of the next video.